Sai Ram, Sai Ram.
Okay. Hey, I'm not.
Ram.
ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಆಂಗಲ್ ಸರಿ ಮಾಡು ಸ್ಟ್ರೇಟ್ ಅಂತ waiting.
Yeah, we will start with Sahana Bhavatu prayer. I request all the students to chant it in their respective halls. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditamastu ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. I offer my humble and loving pranams at the divine lotus feet of our master, Sadguru Sri Madhusudan Sai Ji, who is the founder of Sri Sathya Sai University for Human Excellence. My humble pranams at the divine consciousness of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, Mother Sharada, and all the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa Thakur. My greetings to all the leadership board of Sathya Sai University for Human Excellence and to all other leaders of Sathya Sai Lokaseva Gurukulam and Sathya Sai Ashram in Mudenahalli. And loving students, few days back, I was contemplating on a question of what is the real achievement in the world, in this ephemeral world? And the quick answer which got to my mind is inward fulfillment and external progress is a formula for success in the world or achievement in the world. And we at Sathya Sai University for Human Excellence are so fortunate that our university is catering to both these needs. Jivita Jivanopadi Vidya, which is for external achievement, Jivita Paramavadi Vidya, the Brahma Vidya, the Atma Vidya, which is for the inner fulfillment. And university has a very lofty mission and lofty ideal of creating gurus for exponents of both Paravidya and Aparavidya and teach this wonderful knowledge, this nectarine knowledge in the rural parts of India. And we are very fortunate to be part of such a great university. And I'm very thankful for the leadership board of Sathya Sai University for Human Excellence for creating programs which often remind us the great saying from Kathopanishad, Uttishta Jagrata Prapya Varannibodhatha Kshurasya Dara Nishita Duratyaya Durgam Patastat Kavayo Vadanti. We are always reminded of that ultimate goal in order to realize Brahman and be Atman and be in the world. And university has come up with one more initiative called Words of Wisdom, where we students interact with real heroes. As Upanishad once again says, Kashit Diraha Amrutatvam Ichan. Real heroes who can turn their eyes inwards and realize that Brahman. We got such a great opportunity to connect to great leaders, and today we have Swami Medhananda from Ramakrishna order. I still remember prophetic words of Bhagavan Sri Sathya Sai Baba, who said that Advaita Vedanta, which was introduced by Adi Shankaracharya, which was distributed in the nook and corner of the world from the monks of Sri Ramakrishna. And Sathya Sai Baba Swami said that we students of Sathya Sai University for Human Excellence should join hands with great organizations like Ramakrishna Mission, ISKCON, or Chaitanya, our Chinmaya Mission, and spread this Vedanta to the rural parts of India, to the nook and corner of the world, and make world a beautiful one. And today we're very fortunate to have Swami Medhananda with us. A small introduction of him. Swami Medhananda is a monk of Ramakrishna order and senior research fellow in philosophy at Ramakrishna Institute of Moral and Spiritual Education, Mysore. He was previously associate professor and head of program in philosophy at Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute, Belur Math, where he taught for over a decade. His current research focuses on Vedantic philosophical traditions, cross-cultural philosophy of religion, cross-cultural approaches to consciousness, Indian scriptural hermeneutics, and philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. He is a section editor for the International Journal of Hindu Studies, Springer, overseeing the submissions in Hindu and cross-cultural philosophy of religion. His latest book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, will be published in the Oxford University in December 2021. The book examines Vivekananda's cosmopolitan engagement with Indian and Western thinkers and makes a case for the contemporary relevance of his philosophical positions. Medhananda is the author of Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, Oxford University Press, and Dialectics of Aesthetics, Eastern University, Oxford University, Humboldt University at Berlin, and many other universities. He earned his PhD in 2009 from the University of California at Berkeley, where he specialized in German aesthetics. He was also a visiting student at McDonnell College, Oxford University, and other few universities. And we are very fortunate to have Swamiji to talk to us. Over to Swamiji. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chidambar, for that generous introduction. I'll be presenting using PowerPoint, so I'll try to share my screen first. So, 1 second. So can you all see the slides? Fine?
Yes, Swami.
Okay, good. Okay, so what I'll be presenting on today is a small part of my book, which was just mentioned in the introduction, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. This presentation will be based on the first chapter of that book. So lectures, discourses are not the best place for very detailed and rigorous discussion of issues. So if you want the most detailed and rigorous discussion of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, I would recommend that you look at chapter 1 of my book. But this is just going to give a kind of overview, and then I'll look forward to answering your questions as well, whatever questions you might have. So the topic today is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. So the first question, I don't know, I'm not familiar with the audience so much. So I don't know how many of you have studied the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, especially as contained in the book, translated into English as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. I'm going to assume that most of you have not studied it, but maybe I'm wrong about that. So in any case, when you study that book, you'll find that Sri Ramakrishna had he gave many philosophical teachings about a wide range of spiritual traditions, including Tantra, Vaishnavism, Advaita Vedanta, Christianity, Islam, and the list goes on. He was aware in Brahmo Samaj, another kind of religious, a modern religious movement that was popular during his time in the 19th century. So he talked about so many different philosophical traditions, and he also spoke on the basis of his own spiritual experiences. So one of the big questions when studying the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna is, how should we interpret his philosophy? Because it has been interpreted in many different ways by different scholars and by different readers of his teachings. And he was not a philosopher in an ordinary sense. He didn't write philosophical textbooks and that. He didn't write anything, in fact. He spoke, and then one of his disciples, Mohandas Gupta, he recorded his teachings, and now we have a book of his teachings. What I found in my research is that there have been 3 main approaches to interpreting Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical teachings. So I'll explain those 3 ways. The first is what I would call the sectarian approach. There are many scholars who have argued that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy should be understood in terms of one of the sects, philosophical sects in India. So for instance, Swami Omkarananda and Swami Dhireshananda, they were both monks of the Ramakrishna order. They argued that Sri Ramakrishna was basically an Advaita Vedanta of Shankara school. Medhananda Gupta, the person I just mentioned, who's the author of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, interestingly, he doesn't agree with them. He believed that Sri Ramakrishna was a Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, so the school of Ramanuja. So this is a direct quotation from his book, Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, where Medhananda Gupta says, Thakur Sri Ramakrishna does not say that this universe is unreal like a dream. He says, if we say so, then the weight of the bale fruit will fall short. His view is not the doctrine of Maya, of Advaita Vedanta, but the doctrine of Vishishtadvaita. So this is Medhananda Gupta's view. And then there are other scholars, especially these Western scholars, Walter Neville and Heinrich Zimmer, who claim that Sri Ramakrishna should be understood as a tantric and that his philosophy is a tantric philosophy. So notice that all of these different scholars are adopting a sectarian approach. What they're saying is that we should understand Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy in terms of one of the existing Indian philosophical sects, whether that sect is Advaita Vedanta or Vishishtadvaita Vedanta or Tantra. That's the first approach. Now, the second approach. I would call this the no philosophy approach. Some people, including Narasingha Sil, he's a scholar based in the US. These scholars claim that Sri Ramakrishna was not very educated. He was a simple bhakta. So we shouldn't try to extract any kind of coherent philosophical view from his teachings. And Aumyo Shen, a historian based in India, I believe in Delhi, he says something similar. He says that Sri Ramakrishna borrowed ideas across Vedantic schools without being sensitive to the problems of their reconciliation. So both of these scholars, Aumyo Shen and Narasingha Sil, are claiming that, look, Sri Ramakrishna was not a professional philosopher. He was barely even educated. He didn't write anything. So let's not even try to extract some kind of philosophy from his teachings. And then there is a third approach, which I call the non-sectarian approach to Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. So many scholars, I mentioned a few of them at the bottom of this slide: Satish Chandra Chatterjee, Swami Shraddhananda, Swami Tapasyananda, and Swami Bhajanananda, who's still living. He's one of our distinguished senior monks in Belur Math. What these scholars claim is that they reject both the first and the second approaches. They reject the first approach, the sectarian approach, because they say that any sectarian interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings will end up being Procrustean. This is an English word meaning reductive. It means that you cannot capture the whole of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy if you try to pigeonhole him into any particular sect, whether that's Advaita or Vishishtadvaita or Tantra or Dvaita or Vaishnavism, whatever it might be. So that's the problem with the first approach, according to these scholars. And the problem with the second approach, this no philosophy approach, is that it underestimates Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical intelligence. Just because he didn't have a formal education does not mean that he didn't have a philosophy. So that's the kind of fallacy of the second approach. They assume that because he doesn't have a PhD or because he didn't write books, that therefore he cannot be a philosopher, or therefore he does not have a coherent philosophy. But these scholars argue against that view. So what these scholars adopting the third approach claim is that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy should be understood as a harmonizing, non-sectarian form of Vedanta. And they give that philosophy different names. So, for instance, Satish Chandra Chatterjee calls Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Samanvayi Vedanta. So, Samanvayi means harmonizing. So, a harmonizing Vedanta. Swami Shraddhananda calls it Samanvayi Advaita. Swami Tapasyananda called it Neo Vedanta. And Swami Bhajananda calls it Integral Vedanta. So, there are different names, but they all agree in rejecting the first and second approaches to Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, and they all agree that Sri Ramakrishna taught a Vedantic philosophy that was non-sectarian, that's very broad, and that's main aim is to harmonize different philosophical and spiritual traditions. This is the idea. So I place myself in this third category. So if you ask, where do I stand? Which approach do I adopt in my book? I adopt the third approach, this non-sectarian approach. And I give Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy a new name. I call it Vijnana Vedanta. And the reason I do is because Sri Ramakrishna himself in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, he would often distinguish two main stages in spiritual experience, Jnana and Vijnana. So I'll explain later in the presentation what he meant by these. But this idea of a spiritual experience of Vijnana, it's very, very important and very, very unique. It's one of the most important and original ideas in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And I call Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijnana Vedanta because his entire Vedantic worldview, his entire Vedantic philosophical system is grounded in the spiritual state of Vijnana. And it's on the basis of Vijnana that he's able to harmonize different religious traditions, different sectarian philosophies like Advaita Vedanta, Vishtadvaita Vedanta, Dvaita Vedanta, Veda Vedanta, and many different kinds of spiritual disciplines, Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga. So now, in my book, I explain this in much greater detail, but I'll just give a summary here. I explain that there are 6 major tenets of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. So I've numbered them 1 through 6. So the first tenet, the first doctrine of Vijnana Vedanta is this. Sri Ramakrishna says that after attaining Brahma Jnana in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, ordinary people leave their body within 21 days. But certain divinely commissioned people known as Ishvara Kotis are able to return from the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi and attain Vijnana, a spiritual state even greater than Brahma Jnana, in which perfect jnana and perfect bhakti are combined. So this is a very important teaching of Sri Ramakrishna's, and it's the foundation of his philosophy. That's why I consider it the first tenet of his philosophy. First of all, he used this term Ishvara Koti, which is not very familiar to most people. And he defines it very specifically as incarnations of God, avatars, and those born as a part of one of those incarnations. In Bengali, it's avatar or avatarat amsha. So amsha, it's either avatara himself or herself and an amsha of an avatara. Those are considered to be Ishvara Kotis. So he says that these special spiritually illumined souls, Ishvara Kotis, they alone can attain the state of Vijnana. And he explains the state of Vijnana by using an analogy. The analogy is of a staircase. This is what Sri Ramakrishna says. He says, the jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, neti, neti. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of neti, neti is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is impersonal, nirguna, is also personal, saguna. This is known as Vijnana. So he's using this analogy of a staircase to explain the 2 stages in spiritual experience, jnana and Vijnana. Jnana is like climbing up the stairs, rejecting everything, rejecting every step, and then reaching the roof, which signifies Nirguna Brahman. Most people leave their body at that stage of Advaitic, the Advaitic realization of Nirguna Brahman. But Ishvara Kotis are those who can come back from the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi and then realize that this world is not unreal, but it's a real manifestation of Shakti, which is the personal aspect of the infinite divine reality. So the Vijnani realizes, so we can go to the next slide. So let's start. So what does the Jnani realize? The Jnani is the traditional Advaita Vedanti, a follower of Shankaracharya, who attains spiritual realization of the impersonal non-dual Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, through the practice of Jnana Yoga, the yoga of discrimination, the yoga of intellectual reasoning. The Vijnani goes beyond the Advaita Jnani by realizing that Brahman is not only impersonal, nirguna, but also personal, saguna. And while the Jnani dismisses this world as a framework of illusion, it's Jagat Mithya, and Sri Ramakrishna uses the Bengali expression Dhoka Tati, which means framework of illusion. The Vijnani embraces this universe as a mansion of mirth, Majar Kuti, because the Vijnani sees everything in this world, all human beings, all animals, all inanimate objects, as different real manifestations of Shakti, of God. Now, there are some important differences between the Gyanis and the Vijnanis' outlooks. So Sri Ramakrishna likens Gyanis, who only seek their own salvation, to a hollow piece of driftwood that sinks if even a bird sits on it. Sometimes Sri Ramakrishna would even say that Gyanis tend to be selfish. They only care about their own enlightenment. By contrast, Vijnanis like Narada, who strive to help others achieve spiritual enlightenment, are like a huge log that not only can float across to the other shore, but can carry many animals and other creatures as well. So he says that Vijnanis come to this world in order to help others to make spiritual progress. And he explicitly said that he was not a Jnani, but a Vijnani. And he said that, for instance, here, he says, I do not have the nature of a Jnani. The divine mother has kept me in the state of a bhakta, a Vijnani. Now, one question that might arise at this point for some of you, I'll just anticipate one question. So I called Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijnana Vedanta, but so far I haven't talked about the Vedanta side of his philosophy. So what is Vedantic about Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta? In several places in the gospel, after he explains the Vijnani's outlook on this world, that the Vijnani sees that God alone has become everything, Sri Ramakrishna adds, he says something like, he says this, for instance, he says, read the Bhagavad Gita, read the Bhagavata and the Vedanta, and you will understand all this. So he explicitly claims that his philosophy based on Vijnana can be found in the Vedantic scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, the Bhagavata, the Upanishads. And Swami Vivekananda, he often emphasized that we can only truly appreciate the non-sectarian and liberal spirit of the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads by studying these scriptures in the light of Sri Ramakrishna's life and teachings. And so Swami Vivekananda had this understanding that, whatever Sri Ramakrishna taught, of course, it's based on his own spiritual experiences, but it also perfectly tallies with the Vedantic scriptures. So in my book, I explain in detail how each of the 6 tenets of Vijnana Vedanta, which I'll explain today, how each of them, you can find support for those tenets in the Upanishads and or the Bhagavad Gita. So to give you a brief hint at where we can find Sri Ramakrishna's idea of Jnana and Vijnana in the Vedantic scriptures, I believe you can find Sri Ramakrishna's ideas about Jnana and Vijnana in the Bhagavad Gita itself. And if any of you have studied the Bhagavad Gita, in several chapters, especially chapter 7 and chapter 9, you'll find that Bhagavan Krishna uses the terms Jnana and Vijnana separately. And different commentators, different Bhashyakaras have interpreted these terms in the Gita in very, very different ways. Shankara interprets them in one way, Ramanuja in another way, Madhva in another way. So Sri Aurobindo, who was very influenced by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, he gave a totally new interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And his interpretation is contained in this big 600-page book. It's a bit intimidating, but it's a very profound work. And I recommend that people who are comfortable with English, I recommend that you study that book carefully. Sri Aurobindo's book is called Essays on the Gita. And there, he interprets the terms Jnana and Vijnana in the Bhagavad Gita just almost exactly the same way that Sri Ramakrishna interpreted the terms Jnana and Vijnana. So according to Sri Aurobindo, Jnana is the essential knowledge of Nirguna Brahman, or the impersonal Atman, while Vijnana is the comprehensive or integral realization that the divine being is all. So notice that the way that Sri Aurobindo interprets these terms Jnana and Vijnana are very similar to Sri Ramakrishna's interpretation, right? Because for Sri Aurobindo, Jnana in the Bhagavad Gita means knowledge of Nirguna Brahman. Whereas Vijnana is the realization that Brahman is both Nirguna and Saguna. And that Saguna Brahman actually manifests, Shakti actually manifests as everything in this world. So this is a brief explanation of why I consider Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy to be a Vedantic philosophy. Now, this brings us to the second tenet of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. Since the rational intellect is inherently limited, spiritual experience is the only reliable basis for arriving at supersensuous spiritual truths. On the supra-rational basis of Vijnana, we can affirm truths about God that appear to be contradictory or illogical to the rational intellect. Sri Ramakrishna was fond of giving this teaching. He often said, can a 1-seer pot hold 10 seers of milk? What he meant is, can our finite minds, as human beings with very limited knowledge, how can we, with our finite intellects, our puny minds, how can we understand the infinite God? This is the basic idea. So the way to know God is not through intellectual reasoning, but through spiritual realization. So the Kathopanishad, for instance, says the same thing. This Atman cannot be known through much study, nor through the intellect, nor through much hearing. But I don't think that Sri Ramakrishna discouraged intellectual reasoning. That would not be true either. In many places, he encourages reasoning, and specifically what he called sat asat vichara, reasoning about the true and the false, about what is permanent and what is transitory. So the things of this world, lust and greed and sense pleasures and these things, we should always reason, if we're sadhakas, if we're spiritual aspirants, we should always reason to ourselves that these are all just a matter of 2 or 3 days, and that these are not the essential things, and that what's important and what's essential and what's eternal is God and our eternal souls. So that's the second tenet. So the third tenet of Vijnana Vedanta is the following. It explains, this is very important, it explains the nature of ultimate reality. So according to Sri Ramakrishna, the infinite divine reality is both personal and impersonal, both with and without form, both immanent in the universe and beyond it, and much more besides. So you can see that Sri Ramakrishna has a very, very broad understanding of God, of the infinite divine reality. He would often say in Bangla, Bhagavan kono iti nei, which can be translated as there is no limit to God. You can never put a limit to God and say God is only nirguna, or God is only saguna, God is only Christ, or God is only Allah, or God is only Krishna, or God is only Rama, right? You can never put a limit to God. That was one of his fundamental teachings. And he made this teaching, he gave this teaching on the basis of the spiritual state of Vijnana. Notice that Sri Ramakrishna says that the Vijnani sees that the reality which is Nirguna is also Saguna. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is Brahman is also Bhagavan. So it's because Sri Ramakrishna realized in the state of Vijnana that the ultimate divine reality is both personal and impersonal, and that it's Christ and Allah and Krishna and Rama and Kali and Durga, and the list goes on. He realized it through his own spiritual experience of Vijnana. And on the basis of Vijnana, he would often say in Bangla, Brahma or Shakti Abhed, which can be translated as Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. So what he means by Brahman here is Nirguna Brahman. And what he means by Shakti is Saguna Brahman, Ishvara, so the Lord of this world. And he's claiming that they are inseparable aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality. And to explain this teaching of the inseparability of Brahman and Shakti, Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Shakti, the personal Shakti, he uses a number of analogies, which I'll explain. And notice, I just want you to notice one very important thing about all these analogies, is that all of these analogies are bidirectional. Okay, so he compares the inseparability of Brahman and Shakti to fire and its power to burn, Agni and its Daika Shakti, milk and its whiteness, the sun and its rays, a gem and its brightness, water and its wetness, a snake and its wriggling motion, and still water and agitated water. Now notice that in each of these cases, you cannot think of the one without thinking of the other. You cannot think of fire without thinking of fire's power to burn. You cannot think of fire's power to burn without thinking of fire. They're inseparable in that sense. And they're inseparable in both directions. And you can apply the same logic to all of these different analogies. That's important philosophically, and I'll explain why now. So a question arises. Do you think Shankaracharya, the great philosopher of Advaita Vedanta from the 8th century, do you think that he would have accepted Sri Ramakrishna's third tenet of Vijnana Vedanta, this idea that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable? It's a very important question to ask. I don't think we ask these questions enough, but it's important to ask it. And I want you all to think for yourselves about how you would answer this question. Do you think Shankara would accept Sri Ramakrishna's teaching that Brahman and Shakti are abhed? So I'll give you just my perspective, but I would like to hear from you as well afterward. So first we can look at what Shankara says about what Sri Ramakrishna calls Shakti, or what Shankara calls Ishvara, the personal God. Shankara says this in his commentary on Brahma Sutra 2.1.14. He says, thus Ishvara's rulership, omniscience, and omnipotence are dependent on the limiting adjuncts conjured up by ignorance, avidya. But from the ultimate standpoint, such terms as the ruler, the ruled, omniscience, etc. cannot be used with regard to the Atman, shining in its own nature after the removal of all limiting adjuncts through knowledge. So this is somewhat of a technical sentence, but I'll try to explain it in simple language. So according to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, there's only one reality. That reality is Nirguna Brahman, or Atman. But if that's the only reality, why is it that I think I'm Swami Medhananda and you think you're different students sitting in a classroom? And why do I see a table, right? Why do I see this whole world of diversity? So what Shankaracharya says is that it's because we're ignorant that we think that we're separate individuals. And it's because we're ignorant that we see duality and that we pray to a personal God. But when we attain knowledge of the Nirguna Brahman, we realize that that's the only truth. And that Jiva, the individual soul, Jagat, this entire world, and Ishvara, the personal God, are all ultimately non-existent. They only existed so long as we were ignorant of the ultimate reality, Brahman. This is Shankara's standpoint. So this is exactly what he's saying in this passage. He's saying, what exactly is the status of Ishvara, the personal God, according to Advaita Vedanta? And Shankara's answer is, the personal God is ultimately non-existent. It's only real so long, Ishvara is only real so long as Jiva and Jagat are real. But Jiva, Jagat, and Ishvara are all products of ignorance. So when we realize Brahman, then there's no longer any personal God, there's no longer any universe, and there's no longer any individual soul. This seems to be Shankara's standpoint. Now, Swami Omkarananda, a monk of the Ramakrishna order, he was a staunch follower of Shankara's Advaita. So he tried to argue that Sri Ramakrishna's teaching that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable agrees with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And he argues this by invoking the Advaitic rope snake analogy, which I assume many of you are familiar with. So according to Advaita Vedanta, Nirguna Brahman is like a rope. And instead of seeing the rope, we mistake the rope as a snake. So this is a traditional analogy used in Advaita Vedanta. But when we attain Brahmagyana, we only see the rope. We no longer see the snake. We realize that that snake was just an illusion. In the same way, Omkarananda is claiming that when Sri Ramakrishna teaches that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, we should understand Nirguna Brahman as the real rope. And we should understand Shakti as the illusory snake superimposed on this rope, which means that what he's interpreting Sri Ramakrishna's teaching to mean that Shakti is inseparable from Brahman in the sense that it has no existence apart from Brahman. And when you attain Brahmagyana, you realize that Shakti is non-existent. This is his interpretation. And another question I have for all of you is, do you find Omkarananda's interpretation convincing? Why or why not? This, again, I want you to think for yourselves about this. And we can discuss this later in the question and answer period, but I'll give you my perspective. I believe that the bidirectionality of Sri Ramakrishna's analogies rules out an Advaitic interpretation of his doctrine of the inseparability of Brahman and Shakti. What do I mean by this? According to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, Shakti, the personal God, or Ishvara, these all mean the same thing. It depends for its existence on Nirguna Brahman, but Nirguna Brahman does not depend on Shakti, since Shakti is ultimately unreal. So just think again about this rope and snake analogy. The snake, this illusory snake, it appears only because the rope is there, right? But the rope can exist apart from the snake. But if you remove the rope, you don't have a snake anymore, right? So it's not bidirectional. This analogy of the rope and the snake is unidirectional. The snake's existence depends on the rope, but the rope's existence does not depend on the snake. But in the case of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, you'll find again and again that Brahman and Shakti are equally dependent on each other because they're inseparable and real aspects of the same divine reality. So he says, for instance, one cannot think of Brahman without Shakti, or of Shakti without Brahman. One cannot think of the Nitya without the Leela, the eternal, right? Or of the Leela without the Nitya. And he also says, coming back to this idea of why do I call Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijnana Vedanta? Why Vedanta? Sri Ramakrishna says the Vedas teach that God is both with and without form, both personal and impersonal. And I don't have all that much time, but I want you to think for yourselves, since you're students of the Vedantic scriptures, I assume. Can you think of examples from the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita that support Sri Ramakrishna's claim? Can you find places in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita which describe God as with form and some which describe God as without form? Can you find passages, mantras in the Upanishads which describe God as personal and some as impersonal? That's a kind of assignment that I want you to think of. And you can also ask me for my own examples in the question and answer period. So the fourth tenet of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. This is very important to understand. So because I've already been explaining how I think Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta differs from Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. However, that we should not think that Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta is not Advaita. It is Advaita, but it's a different kind of Advaita from Shankara's Advaita philosophy. So this is what the fourth tenet explains. There are two levels of Advaitic realization. Remember the first tenet, which is that there are two stages, Jnana and Vijnana. So what this fourth tenet explains is that both Jnana and Vijnana are types of Advaitic realization. While the Jnani realizes the acosmic, non-dual reality of Nirguna Brahman in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the Vijnani returns from the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi and attains the richer, world-affirming, non-dual realization that God has become everything. So according to Sri Ramakrishna, from the traditional Jnani standpoint, from the standpoint of a Shankarite, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, Brahman alone is the reality and everything else is unreal. But for the Vijnani, according to Sri Ramakrishna, the Vijnani does not look upon this world as Mithya. He doesn't say Jagat Mithya. He says Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. The Bhakta also has a realization of oneness. So you notice that this is a very Advaitic language that Sri Ramakrishna is using. The Bhakta also realizes oneness. He sees that there's nothing but God. Instead of saying that the world is unreal like a dream, he says that God has become everything. So Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta is an Advaitic philosophy, but you can call it a world-affirming Advaitic philosophy. By contrast, Shankara's Advaita, we can call a world-negating Advaita philosophy because it says Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. The only reality is Nirguna Brahman, and Jiva, Jagat, and Ishvara are ultimately non-existent. But according to Sri Ramakrishna, God is not only Nirguna, but also Saguna, Shakti. And Shakti manifests as every individual soul and as every inanimate object in this universe. One of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Turiyananda, he was a great yogi and scholar of Vedanta. He expressed Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana standpoint very nicely in the form of a mantra. He said this in Bengali: Brahma Shotto, Jagat Shotto, Shab Shotto, Shotte Pran Pratishtito. So the English translation would be Brahman is true, Brahman is real, the world is real, everything is real, life is based on truth. So this captures very nicely the world-affirming Advaita of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. And then we can ask ourselves, well, do we find this world-affirming Advaita mentioned in the Vedanta scriptures? And you'll find it everywhere. So I just gave one example, Chandogya Upanishad 3.14.1, the famous mantra, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. Everything you see is actually Brahma. And if we look at how Shankara interprets this statement from Chandogya Upanishad, he explains it as follows. In his commentary on Brahma Sutra 1.3.1, Shankara says the aim of this statement in the Upanishads is to dissolve the universe. The Sanskrit is prapancha pravilapanartham. Everything is Brahman according to Shankara in the sense that if you strip everything of their names and forms, namarupa, then only Brahman remains. This is what he means. He says, whenever the Upanishads say everything is Brahman, what the Upanishads mean is remove the Namarupa from Jagat. What's left is Nirguna Brahman. But by contrast, Sri Ramakrishna holds that all Namarupa themselves, names and forms, are themselves Brahman. So this is a very subtle point, but it's very important to understand. So Sri Ramakrishna in one place, he uses the analogy of wax. Okay, so he says that as a Vijnani, I realize it's as if everything I see in this world is made of wax. What he means by wax here is divine consciousness. Everything, every name and form, this table, this laptop, each human being is a different real manifestation of God, of Brahman. So I hope you notice how Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, Vijnana Vedanta, takes these Upanishadic statements, Sarvam Kalpadam Brahma, and there are many others. In Gita, you have the statement in chapter 7, Vasudevaha Sarvam Iti. Vasudeva is everything. Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy gives us a more direct and more literal way of interpreting these statements from the Vedantic scriptures. And the fifth tenet, so we're almost there. We have just 2 tenets left. So the fifth tenet of Vijnana Vedanta, the Vijnani who accepts the reality of both the Nitya, which means the eternal, and the Lila, which is the sort of non-eternal play of God, is able to adopt various attitudes toward and attain various forms of union with God on different planes of consciousness, all of which are true. So this is a bit difficult to understand. So I'll give some direct quotations from Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna says, the Vijnani always sees God. He sees God even with his eyes open. Sometimes he comes down to the Leela from the Nitya, and sometimes he goes up to the Nitya from the Leela. And he uses a nice analogy. He says, he used the analogy of a flute. He says, why should I say nothing but I am he, soham, soham. I want to play various melodies on my instrument with 7 holes. Why should I say only Brahman, Brahman? I want to call on God through all the moods, through Shanta, Dasya, Sathya, Vatsalya, and Madhura. I want to make merry with God. I want to sport with God. What Sri Ramakrishna is saying is that don't think that only Nirguna Brahman is the highest and that's the only form of God. Let's enjoy God in various forms. Let's enjoy God as Christ, as Kali, as Krishna, and as Nirguna Brahman. Just as an expert flute player, he's not just going to play one note on the flute. He'll play ragas and raginis, whole songs, using all 7 notes. So it's a very beautiful analogy to explain his attitude, which is very broad. Let's celebrate all the different forms of God. And finally, the 6th tenet of Vijnana Vedanta, Sri Ramakrishna says various religious faiths and spiritual philosophies are equally effective paths to the goal of God realization. So this is Sri Ramakrishna's famous teachings on the harmony of all religions. And he gives this teaching in many ways, but one of my favorites is this one. He says, God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite. Tini ananto, patho ananto. That's the original Bengali. So you'll notice that Vijnana Vedanta 6, that 6th tenet, derives from the 3rd tenet. Remember, the 3rd tenet was that God is both personal and impersonal, and with and without form. Since God himself is infinite and can take on these different forms, there must be correspondingly infinite ways of approaching and ultimately realizing God. So if God were more limited, if God were only impersonal, then there's only one path to God, which is Jnana Yoga, because only Jnana Yoga is based on Nirguna Brahman. If God were only personal, then only the theistic religions would be true, Christianity, Islam, or Vaishnavism, these things. But because God is infinite, God is both personal and impersonal, both with and without form, there must be infinite paths to reaching God. So different religious traditions are focusing on different aspects of the same Godhead. This is the idea. And he explains this very profound teaching by using the parable of a chameleon. This is what he says. He says, once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, when I went into the forest, I also saw that animal. But why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it. On being asked, he replied, "Yes, I live under this tree and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon, and sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color, and now it has none. In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. He alone knows that God reveals himself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal, saguna, as well as impersonal, nirguna. Only the man who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument." So notice two things about this analogy of the chameleon. The first thing is the chameleon can assume different colors, blue, violet, gray, but sometimes it's also colorless. So what is the colorless chameleon? The colorless chameleon corresponds to Nirguna Brahman of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And the different colors of the chameleon correspond to different forms of the personal God, whether it's Christ or Allah or Krishna or Rama or so on, or Kali. And notice that Sri Ramakrishna does not, there's no implication in this analogy, in this parable, that somehow the colorless chameleon is the truest form of the chameleon. It's not like that. The blue chameleon is as true as the violet chameleon, and the violet chameleon is as true as the colorless chameleon, which means he's putting Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman on an equal footing. That's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to notice about this analogy is that there's this person sitting under the tree. He's a very unique individual because other people, they'll come for a few moments, they'll look at the chameleon in one color and say, that chameleon is red. Or another person will come 1 hour later and say, that many different colors and can also be colorless. Who is that person sitting under the tree? That's the question. I believe that person is the Vijnana. So again, we come back to Vijnana Vedanta. Because remember that according to Sri Ramakrishna, the Vijnani realizes that Brahman is both Nirguna and Saguna, that God is both personal and impersonal, and that God can assume many different forms, right? So that's very important to keep in mind, that the man living under the tree is the Vijnani who realizes the infinitude of God, and on that basis can embrace many different religious traditions and spiritual paths. So I just made a diagram using a mountain to explain what I think is the difference between the way that traditional Advaita Vedantins, who are followers of Shankaracharya, how they harmonize the world religions, and how Sri Ramakrishna and followers of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, how they explain the harmony of religions. So first, I just want to explain briefly the Advaita, this is the Shankarite approach to harmonizing the world religions. So for instance, these modern Advaitins, they would say something like this: Christians, through the practice of Christian religion, can realize the Christian God, and Muslims, through the practice of Islam, they can realize God as Allah. And Hindus, through the practice of different Hindu faiths, theistic traditions, they can realize God as any of the different forms of the personal God, Rama, Krishna, Kali, Shiva, and so on. So they can all realize the personal God. However, according to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, the personal God is not the highest reality. So that is not the highest goal in life. Realizing the personal God that does not amount to salvation. So Advaitins say that ultimately the Christians have to stop their practice of Christianity and practice Advaita Jnana Yoga, and then realize the highest reality, which is Nirguna Brahman. And the same is true of Muslims, and the same is true of theistic Hindus, Bhaktas. They also have to ultimately give up their bhakti, practice Jnana Yoga, and realize God as Nirguna. So you'll notice that Shankara's Advaita, it harmonizes the world religions, but in a narrower way, because they take the goal of every religious path to be Nirguna Brahman. And therefore, these theistic religious traditions cannot take us all the way to the highest goal. They can only take us to the realization of Saguna Brahman. And then you have to practice Jnana Yoga, and then you can realize Nirguna Brahman. Now, How does Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the world religions? By contrast, this is how I think he does it. He says Christians, through the practice of Christianity, will directly realize some real aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, which leads directly to salvation. So Christians, because they worship God as the Father and as Christ, that's how they think of God. They'll realize Christ directly through their own religion. They don't need to practice Jnana Yoga. Same is true of Muslims. They'll realize God is Allah without having to practice Jnana Yoga, and they don't need to realize God is Nirguna Brahman at all. That's not necessary for them. Same is true of theistic Hindus. Same is true of Advaita Vedantins. Advaita Vedantins and Buddhists, they are interested, they're not interested in the personal God, but they are interested in the idea of God as pure consciousness. So they will realize God as pure consciousness, but they'll also realize it through their respective paths. So the idea is that Sri Ramakrishna harmonizes all the world religions in a very egalitarian way, in a very broad-minded way, because he puts all the different religious traditions on an equal footing. He doesn't put devotional traditions on a lower level than Advaita Vedanta. And let me just back up. So I'll just take a couple more minutes. So what is salvation according to Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta? As I just mentioned, for Advaita Vedantins, salvation consists in the total dissolution of the individual in the impersonal, non-dual Brahman. Nirguna Brahman is the only reality. So salvation means I no longer think of myself as an individual, as Swami Medhananda, as something separate from God, but I become Brahman. I realize that I am that Brahman, which is the only reality. But for bhaktas, salvation consists in eternal loving communion with God as eternally endowed with form and personality. In Bangla, the term is Nitya Sakara. In a higher realm, whether that realm is called Vishnu Loka or Raja Loka or Ramakrishna Loka or anything else. So bhaktas don't want to get dissolved. They want to dwell with God, with the personal God, eternally. So the way that Sri Ramakrishna put this is the bhakta's attitude is, I do not want to be sugar. I love to eat sugar. And Sri Ramakrishna equally embraces both types of salvation. He doesn't say that the Advaitic form of salvation is higher than the bhakti form of salvation. He doesn't put the bhakti form of salvation higher than the Advaitic one. He says that both forms of salvation are equally valid. And you can attain the kind of salvation that you're looking for, that you want. So where does he say this? He says it very emphatically. On 23rd May, 1885, one of his visitors was a staunch Shankarite, an Advaitin, and he asked Mahima. He said, I have a question to ask, sir. A lover of God needs nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? Sri Ramakrishna answered, it cannot be said that bhaktas need nirvana. Nirvana here meaning this Advaitic state of salvation, where you no longer remain as an individual. Bhaktas do not need nirvana. According to some schools, there is an eternal Krishna, and there are also his eternal devotees, Nitya Krishna and Nitya Bhakta. Krishna is spirit embodied, and his abode also is spirit embodied. Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham, Chinmoy Shama, and Chinmoy Dham. Krishna is eternal, and the devotees also are eternal. So he's saying, no, bhaktas do not need this Advaitic form of salvation. They want to dwell eternally with the personal God, whether that personal God is Christ or Krishna or Allah, and they'll get that. For them, that's salvation. That's not a lower form of salvation than the Advaitic type of salvation. Finally, last slide, I just wanted to summarize briefly the three core ideas of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. And I want you to think about whether I want you to compare these 3 points with Shankara's philosophy and ask yourself, do they match or not? So number one, the soul reality is the infinite divine reality, which is the impersonal non-dual Brahman in one aspect, and the personal God, Shakti, in another aspect. So this is captured in Sri Ramakrishna's teaching, Brahma or Shakti Abhed. Nirguna Brahman is inseparable from Saguna Brahman. Second point, the world and all individual souls, Jagat and Jivas, are real manifestations of Shakti, which is itself a real aspect of the infinite divine reality. And third point, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Raja Yoga, the yoga of meditation, are all direct paths to the goal of God realization. So if we have time and you're interested, we can think about how these points, whether Shankara and his school would agree with these points or whether they would differ. Thank you very much. And now I look forward to hearing from you. I'm not hearing anybody. So I can't hear you, Mohan.
Swamiji, so enlightening. Actually, few days back, as one of the faculty mentioned, am I?
Mohan, I can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay.
Now I can hear you, I think. Go ahead. I can't hear anybody. Is there something wrong with the connection on your side?
No, it's fine. It's fine, Swami. His connection is not proper.
Oh, I
He'll
see. So
speak.
can somebody else conduct the question and answers?
Saram Swamiji.
No.
Swamiji, we have a question. How is Vijnana Vedanta different from Vallabhacharya Shuddha Dvaita?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Vallabha Shuddha Dvaita is another bhakti school of Vedanta. And there are a number of similarities between the two, between Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta and Vallabha's Shuddha Dvaita, but I think there are also some differences. So in terms of similarities, one thing that's very important is that, so if we take a broad view of Vedanta, according to Shankaracharya, the highest reality is only Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal Brahman. And he does not accept the reality of the personal God, ultimately. According to Ramanuja and Madhva, by contrast, the ultimate reality is only Saguna, the personal God, and not Nirguna. It's not Nirguna Brahman, as the Advaitins have it. Now, the interesting thing is that Vallabha Shuddha Dvaita and one more tradition of Vedanta, Achintya Bheda Veda, the school of Chaitanya, Mahaprabhu, they take a different view. They claim that Brahman is both Nirguna and Saguna. God is both personal and impersonal. So in this respect, the Vedantic schools of Vallabha and Achintya Bheda Veda come closer to Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta than Shankara's philosophy or Ramanuja's philosophy or Madhva's philosophy, because only these two schools of Vedanta, Vallabha Shuddha Dvaita and Chaitanya's Achintya Bheda Vedanta, accept the reality of both Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman. So that's a similarity. Now, but what is one of the differences between Vallabha Shuddha Dvaita and Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta? According to Vallabha, and also this is true also of Achintya Bheda Veda, Saguna Brahman is higher than Nirguna Brahman. They're not put on an equal footing. So according to Vallabhacharya, the highest reality is Krishna, Bhagavan Krishna, who is Saguna. He's the personal God. And they say that Nirguna Brahman is just the charanam, just a foot, a very minor aspect of Krishna himself. So they're putting Brahman on a lower level than Saguna Brahman, which is Krishna. So they say that the Advaita Vedantins who want to realize Brahman, they'll realize Brahman, but it's a lower form of salvation than realizing Krishna in Vrajaloka. By contrast, according to Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman are on an equal footing. And the Advaitic form of salvation is equally valuable as the Bhakti form of salvation. So Bhaktas want to eat sugar. What does eating sugar mean? It means they want to dwell in some higher loka, like Vishnu Loka or Vraja Loka, with the personal God. Sri Ramakrishna says, wonderful. That's the highest salvation for you Bhaktas. Advaita Vedantins want to dissolve their individuality in Nirguna Brahman and and there's no question of going to some higher loka. Sri Ramakrishna says, wonderful. Then you Advaitins, for you Advaitins, that's the highest salvation. He doesn't say that one form of salvation is higher than another. Whereas both Vallabhas, Shuddha Advaita and Achintya Bheda Veda, they both make a kind of hierarchy, and they say that Saguna Brahman is higher than Nirguna Brahman, and therefore the bhakti form of salvation is higher than the Advaitic form of salvation. Thank you.
The next question is Vijnana Vedanta limited to few people? Can a common people attain this Vijnana Vedanta?
That's a very good question, and it's one that I've thought about for a long time. I think there's no easy answer to this question. I think that if you study the gospel carefully in the original Bengali, you'll find most of the time, Sri Ramakrishna seems to suggest that only a special small group of people, these Ishvara Kotis, these divinely commissioned souls, only they can attain the state of Vijnana. However, there are some places in the gospel where some of his visitors ask this type of question. They say, well, you're teaching about Vijnana, but you're saying that only Ishvara Kotis can attain it. How is that relevant to us, ordinary people? And then he says, sometimes he says, by God's grace, anybody can attain the state of Vijnana. So I think the answer is a little bit complicated. I would say that generally he maintains that only Ishvara Kotis attain the state of Vijnana, but he also admits exceptions, in that if there are some exceptional people who through God's grace and through intense spiritual practice, they can also attain the same state.
One more question is Sahaja Samadhi is same as what you explained in Vijnana Vedanta? Is Sahaja Samadhi same?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. See, Sahaja Samadhi, the problem is it's a bit vague, because it can be, there can be different forms of Sahaja Samadhi in different philosophical traditions. For instance, many people say that Sri Ramana Maharshi was a great Advaita Vedanta, follower of Shankaracharya. He was in a state of Sahaja Samadhi because he was still talking to others, which is a kind of, he was not always in a state of Nirgapa Samadhi. So he was talking to other people. That's a kind of state of Sahaja Samadhi, but from the standpoint of Shankara, because he would still say Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. But for Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta is, as I said, it's a world-affirming Advaita Vedanta. So you can call it a different kind of Sahaja Samadhi, where in this state of Sahaja Samadhi, you realize not Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, but Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. And that you embrace this entire world as a real manifestation of God. So that's a different kind of Sahaja Samadhi from the Ramana Maharshi type of Sahaja Samadhi. That's what I would say. But what they have in common, sorry, I'll just add one final thing. But what these two types of Sahaja Samadhi have in common, the Ramana Maharshi type and the Sri Ramakrishna type, is that you don't have to be in some trance-like state, some higher state of consciousness. You are in a higher state of consciousness, but at the same time, you're able to interact with others and live in the world apparently normally, but constantly with this divine awareness in the background.
How would Swamiji differentiate between Achintya Beda Abeda Tattva and Shuddha Advaita?
Yeah, I mean, these are very technical questions, and what I would recommend you do is you should look at a wonderful book written by Swami Tapasyanandaji, Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. So that book it explains in detail all of the different Bhakti schools. It explains Vallabha Shuddha Advaita, it explains Chaitanya's Achintya Bheda Veda Vedanta, and explains the similarities and differences. So I can't go into all the details now. I'll just mention one difference is with regard to the relationship between Brahman and this world. So according to Shuddha Advaita, they explain this relationship between Brahman and Jagat with this doctrine called Avikrita Parinamavada. Avikrita Parinamavada, which means it's the doctrine that Brahman somehow transforms into this world while at the same time remaining unchanged. So it's this very paradoxical doctrine where Brahman becomes the world and yet remains unchanged. This is the doctrine endorsed by Vallabha Shuddha Advaita school. And there are many technical details which I'm not going into. Now, Achintya Bheda Veda does not accept Avikrita Parinamavada. So that's one difference. And instead, their school is called Achintya Bheda Veda because they claim that the relationship between Brahman and its Shaktis and Brahman in the world is achintya, which means it's unthinkable. We cannot understand with our finite intellects how Brahman relates to this world. Now, that's similar to, Vallabha also has a similar idea, but this special Shuddhadvaita doctrine of Abhikrita Parinamavada is not accepted by Achintya Bheda followers.
Why do you think so many philosophies exist, and how to have or create a harmony among all the philosophies? For example, Achintya Veda, Veda Tattva, people sometimes criticize Advaita Vedanta.
Yeah. So
how to create
the reason why
harmony?
the reason why there are so many different philosophies and spiritual paths is because there are so many different types of people. I think this is the fundamental answer. There are some people who have a tendency toward Jnana Yoga. So for them, Advaita Vedanta is a great path, or some form of Buddhism. There are some people who just almost from birth or almost from childhood, they happen to have a spontaneous love for Krishna or for Christ. So for each of them, there's a different religion. So for those who have Christian leanings, there's Christianity. For those who like Allah, there's Islam. For those who love Krishna, there's Vaishnavism. So for those who like Kali, there's Shaktism, and so on and so on. So we're not all the same, right? So each one of us is different. I'm one type of person. I have certain preferences. I have certain tendencies. I have certain samskaras. And each of you is a different individual with different samskaras, different tendencies, different preferences. So the more religions and more spiritual paths we have, the more likely it is that we will find the religion that is best suited to our temperament. This is the basic idea. So how do we harmonize all the different paths? This is exactly what Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta is. So I hope that in the course of my lecture, how Sri Ramakrishna harmonized all of these different religious traditions. The idea is that on the basis of his very unique spiritual state of Vijnana, he realized that God is not only Nirguna Brahman, but also all the different forms of the personal God, which means that he gives validity, equal validity, to all of the different theistic traditions across the world: Christianity, Islam, Vaishnavism, Shaktism, and so on, Sufism, Sikhism. And at the same time, he gives validity to the non-bhakti paths, like Advaita Vedanta and like Buddhism.
Is Vijnana Vedanta and Bhavamukha similar?
Yeah. So basically, Bhavamukha is, I take it as a synonym of Vijnana. If you study the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, you won't find the word Bhavamukha used. You'll find the word Vijnana used. But in the Leela Prasanga, which is the authorized biography of Sri Ramakrishna, written by his direct monastic disciple, Swami Sharadananda, you'll find that Sharadananda is often using the word Bhavamukha, but he never used the word Vijnana. But the way that Sri Ramakrishna explains the state of Bhavamukha, he explains it exactly in the same way as he explains the state of Vijnana in the Kathamrita. So in my view, and not just in my view, there are others who agree with me, like Swami Tapasananda, I think that Vijnana and Bhavamukha are basically synonymous.
Swamiji, this is regarding, I have intended to do some research on Ramakrishna. This is my question regarding that. Jnanis enjoy the Sat aspect of Brahman, Yogis enjoy the Chit aspect of Brahman, and Bhaktas enjoy the Ananda aspect of Brahman. This is my research. Did Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa talk about this?
Not in that way. I mean, I think that it's an interesting idea, but I would say that Sri Ramakrishna I don't think he would necessarily say that bhaktas will only enjoy the Ananda aspect. I think they can enjoy all three aspects, Sat, Chit, and Ananda. And Jnanis, for instance, I don't think it would make sense to say that Jnanis enjoy or realize only the Sat aspect and not the Chit aspect, because of course for Advaita Vedanta, Brahman is pure consciousness. So I think I would not compartmentalize the Sat and Chit and Ananda. I think there's a reason why Brahman is Sat Chit Ananda, why they're inseparably connected. So I don't think you can say that certain aspirants realize one aspect of Satchitananda, whereas others experience other aspects. I don't think it's quite like that. I think you can do it in maybe a less rigid way, where you can say that Advaita Vedantins are not interested in the Ananda aspect as much as Bhaktas are. I think that we can agree on that. But I think with Sat and Chit, I wouldn't say that Gyanis are going for Sat and that yogis are going for Chit. I think that becomes artificial.
Thank you for taking questions.
I can't hear you.
Oh,
I can't hear you.
am I audible now?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please repeat
Oh.
what you said.
Yeah. I was just saying thanks for the wonderful talk. We were discussing about this Brahma Satya and Jagat Satya a few days back. Our master was explaining this, that he was telling that neti neti, not this, not this. He added one more word called not only this. So it was so
That's
wonderful.
very nice. Yeah. That's excellent.
It was so
That's nice.
wonderful that you also spoke on the same thing. And we are lots of love and gratitude from all the students of Sathya Sai University for showing us.
Thank you so much.
There are a few more questions. I will write in the mail, Swami, because we are out of time. I'll write in the mail. So we will end this session with Sahana. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadi Tamastuma Vitvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you, Swami. Sai Ram.
Thank you.